Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So what I'm going to go through today is I'm going to show you a 3-step process to fixing your hip bursitis. Now hip bursitis is something that can affect a lot of people. It's generally on the one side more so than both, but people can have it on both sides. And by the end of this video, hopefully you'll understand why that is and how to solve it, how to get rid of it, to stop it from coming back again. And it's important to make that information available because hip bursitis can often persist for a long time for a lot of people. It can come and go and it can never really go away for a long time. So I want to show you what you might be doing wrong or what you might be missing and the crucial pieces of the puzzle to fix your hip bursitis going forward. So with this 3-step process, we're going to cover some information that you may not know. A lot of it are things that we find clinically that work, not necessarily just the information that's out there on the internet at the moment. This will hopefully be something actionable and real, for want of a better term. So basically with hip bursitis, what a lot of people know, and if you found this video, you'll definitely know what it is, but there's the bony bit at the side of your hip. Now, this bony bit is an attachment point for a lot of your glute muscles and hip muscles. And there's a sac of fluid called a bursa, which sits underneath a tendon as it attaches into, well, underneath the tendons as they attach into that bony bit of the hip. And what this bursa or this sac of fluid does, it's a lubricator. So instead of having two surfaces that rub against each other, cause friction and wear away and become damaged, your body has these bursa strategically placed throughout your body in areas of high friction to solve that problem. Now, when we look at a bursitis, traditionally, there's a lot of things that we do. We tend to ice it, we tend to inject it. We do all these things that you generally don't have to do or shouldn't have to do. Obviously, if it's a nasty version, you might want to consider them, but for the majority of hip bursitis, we tend to manage it and do things that are disadvantageous, that don't necessarily get you to where you want to go faster, but we do it because we think we have the best intentions in mind. So in this 3-step process, I'm hopefully going to show you how to fix your hip bursitis without using ice, injections, medications. There's some very simple things you can put in place as long as you understand why it's there in the first place. It's a crucial piece of the puzzle, as I said before. So to jump right into it, the first step is basically, it speaks for itself. We want to settle down the irritation and the inflammation in that hip as best as possible. Now, as I mentioned before, we don't want you to reach for that ice pack. And I've created a video before about why we shouldn't necessarily be icing our injuries. And you should see a link pop up the top here in a second. And please go and watch that if you're interested. But the idea basically is that we want to try and settle down the hip without having to resort to ice and injections and medications. So one of the things that we know is that hip bone, which is where the bursitis tends to be, a lot of the musculature around that becomes tight, becomes weak and dysfunctional. So one of the things we want to go for is, instead of reaching for an ice pack, we want to reach for a ball of some sort. So if your hip is sore, a tennis ball might be better than a lacrosse ball, but depending on what your tolerance is, go for a ball that you feel works the best. And all we want to do is we want to get the ball and put it into your glutes, basically. We're going to try and free up the tissue around the bursa, feed some slack to it, take the load off it, give your brain and nervous system a chance for that to settle down. But the important distinction is you don't need to be putting pressure on your irritated bursa. So you don't put it where it hurts. You basically want to go around the outskirts of that, feed some slack to it. So if you start where your back pocket might be, pretty much right in the heart of your glutes, it can feel quite tender, as I said, but if you can move around, find a spot that feels tight and tender. So I found a tight spot, tender spot for me. So you have a few options. You can just stay here, try and relax, let the ball sink in and let the muscle give over time. Or we can speed that process up a little bit by introducing movement to the equation. So with the hip joint tends to rotate inwards and outwards. So we can do that. So you can't see my foot here, it's off sort of screen, but my foot's going up and into the middle and then out to the side, into the middle, out to the side. So we want to tack down that tightness. We want to then create some rotation to shear that tightness free, get that mobility back into the tissue. Another way that you can do this is you can bend your knee and hip, and you can do a similar idea here where you can sort of bring your knee towards midline. This is adding a little bit more adduction to the mix. Again, it just hits a different piece of that puzzle. For me, this feels a little bit more tender, but I can feel it starting to give and I can feel that tissue starting to shear free. And what we want to do here is, so I'm at the back of the hip here, so where the back pocket is. I can go above, so where the point of the hip is, I can come above that and hit some of the glutes above that. So just underneath the iliac crest, or the bone of the hip bone at the top, where the hip pointer is. Same thing again, we can find a tender spot through here, a tight spot. I can then turn my foot in and out, so internally, externally rotate that hip. Same thing again, I can do the same thing higher up, trying to get some movement into those tissues. So again, make sure you feel comfortable, make sure you feel safe, don't do anything that feels horrible. But this is really, really good at changing the way that you load up that irritated hip. And if it's irritated and everything around it is tight, you're always going to be tugging on that sort of sensitized, irritated part of the hip. So by freeing up that tissue around it, you can really start to feed some slack to it, take the load off that hip bursa, giving it a chance to settle down faster. So that's step one. We want to free up the tissue around the bursa. Step two is often a little bit different, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky in terms of what we want to do to fix this. Now, what a lot of people don't realize with hip dysfunction, and hip bursitis more specifically, is the majority of hip bursitis isn't a hip problem, it's a back problem. Most of the hip bursitis is just a consequence of the lower back, or the mid to low back, becoming dysfunctional and shutting down that part of the hip, tightening it up, making it weaker, and that bursitis, or that bursa, is a consequence of poor lower back function. It's the part of the body that doesn't tolerate the conditions that it's been put in. So again, if we're just icing it, if we're injecting it, if we're doing all these exercises that are just specific to your hip, we're missing the bigger picture, and we can't take that handbrake off and restore normal function, get rid of your pain as quickly as possible. So how this works basically is, in your lower back, so where your rib cage meets your lower back, there's a whole cluster of nerves, there's a whole bunch of segments that have nerves that control and feed information to your hip. They're the ones that, I guess, that power your glutes essentially. So if there's a section of your back, so my rib cage ends about here, so in this section and a little bit below, what you'll find is, on one side or the other, so it doesn't have to be the same side. So if my hip bursitis is on this side, the issue of my lower back can be on the same side, or it can be the opposite side. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same side. But what we're going to look for is, we're going to look for stiffness and tightness in those segments. And if we can free up those segments, again, with something as simple as a ball, we can basically unkink the hose that's supplying the information to your hips to sort of re-energize, reawaken, I guess, the neural function of those muscles. It won't become as tight, it won't keep tightening up, you'll get some strength back just from improving the function of your lower back. And as I said, it's missed a lot because your back doesn't often hurt, but what we see clinically is when we treat the back and we free these sections up, you can see an automatic increase in function of that hip. And if that hip is still irritated, once that irritation dies down, you get that function back a lot faster. So we want to do the same thing. So step two, we're going to grab the ball. We're going to place it right in the middle of your spine, where the bony bits are. We're going to get the ball just to roll off to one side. So I'm going to roll it off to this side. And how this looks is, we're just going to lie down on the ball. We're going to go looking for that tightness and that stiffness. So we want to make sure that we're pretty close to the spine here. But again, back your instincts in, back your gut feels, back how this feels, and go looking for spots that feel a bit tight, a bit stiff, potentially a bit tender, but they may not. And then what I want you to do is, once you've found a spot that you think, gee, that might be stiff and tight, take note of how stiff and tight that feels, how easy the ball sinks in, then compare it to the exact same spot on the other side. So I'm moving the ball across to this side now, and what I can feel here is, the ball feels like it sinks in a lot easier on this side. It doesn't feel as stiff, it doesn't feel as tight. So what that tells me is that this side closest to the camera is the side that needs to free up. So what I want you to do is, once you've found that spot, just stay here. Just let the ball press in, just let the ball sink in as best as you feel comfortable, and stay here until you feel like it starts to free up. And then once you've done that, what I want you to do, and it might take 30 seconds, a minute, it might take 5 minutes if it's quite stiff, is then just move the ball up a tiny little bit further, or down, or a little bit further out to that side. Make sure you're capturing all the stiff and tight spots that you can find in that area, and free them up. And if you're lucky, what you'll find is when you're on those spots, you may actually hit a part of your spine. So if you're pressing into this part of your spine, just off to the side, you may then start to feel something radiating to your hip. You might feel some tightness in your hip. You might feel something connect. If you do, then obviously that's fantastic to help you make that connection between how important that mid to low back is and how that connects to the dysfunction in your hip. Not everyone gets that sensation, but when we're talking about potentially an area that a lot of people don't think of when they're trying to treat the hip, sometimes it really helps for you to feel that connection. So you just don't feel like we're making it up, that it's based on something important and something you need to change for that hip to go away for good. So again, step 2 involves freeing up your spine. The next part of step 2 involves strengthening your spine, and we can do this in a number of different ways. One of the most common ones is just to do some planks. Now, a simple way to do a plank for most people is just to come up onto we'll do hands first, but the idea is you want to stay nice and straight through your back. We don't want you to be tilting your back up. We don't want you to drop your hips. Try and stretch yourself out as far as you feel comfortable. If you find it too easy, obviously come down onto your elbows, making it a little bit harder. If it's still too easy, you can certainly do this for longer, but what you can also do is do it on an unstable surface. So have your feet up on something, you can have your hands on something. There's a number of variations, but the idea is we want you to practice something like 30-second holds, 5 reps of that. If 30 seconds is too easy, go for a minute. The more time you can spend trying to maintain a straight spine against gravity, the stronger those muscles are going to get around the spine. And when we know that a section of your back is stiff, and you've found that already with the ball, there has to be a reason why that's stiff. So we need to make sure that we're reinforcing that with strong musculature. And a plank is a very simple way to do that. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can strengthen your core, but start with a plank and work up from there and deviate based on how easy or hard that feels for you. So step 1, we want to settle it down. Step 2, we want to take care of the hidden sort of predisposing features that cause it, which is improving the function of your back. The third step to fixing your hip dysfunction or your hip bursitis is to make sure that you're also solving the reason why your back and potentially your hip have become dysfunctional in the first place. And this is generally the most boring step, but it's potentially the most important, or one of the most important, because if you don't correct this and you leave it to just exist on its own, then you can't fix it long term. Your symptoms can come and go and they can go away, but the overall function of that area won't return to normal until you go through this step. So we've covered this a lot in previous videos, so you'll hopefully notice a theme here, but the thing we're talking about is your posture. So as I mentioned a second ago, if there's a section of your back that you've found is stiff, particularly on one side, there has to be a genuine reason why that happens. It doesn't just happen for the sake of it. And clinically, experience tells us that the areas that become stiff and tight in your body are just reacting to the positions and the shapes that you put them in. Without you realizing it, you're unintentionally asking those parts of your body to become stiffer and tighter to support a increase in load. So if there's a section in your back and off to the side a bit that has become stiff and tight, it's very, very likely that that's going to correlate with a position that you're getting into where you're relaxing through that part of your body, creating a hinge, and if it's on one side, you're probably going to be twisting or shifting to one side. So how that looks for a lot of people is basically sitting down on the couch in this curved, sort of hinged position. You might find that if you're driving, you're sort of off to one side a little bit, you're bent through here and then twisting to bias one side or the other. If you've got a really comfortable spot on the couch that you like to sit in, if you've got an armrest, particularly with the restrictions at the moment, there's going to be this shape that you're unknowingly but consistently hammering your spine into and staying there, asking it to change over time. So the third step to this, being aware of that's tricky because we don't sit or lean over just for the sake of it. We're often doing something. But the hardest part of step 3 is trying to improve your awareness and how much you value good spinal shapes so that you can change those over time, because you can spend all this time strengthening your hip, freeing up your back, strengthening your back. But if you keep putting it in a bad position, you're always asking it to get weak and stiff again. So we can't ultimately solve this problem, like many other problems, without taking a few steps back and solving the root cause of the positions that you're in. So So what I ask most of my patients to do, and I'll ask the same of you guys, is when you're doing the things that you do most often, so the next time you're sitting on the couch, just stand up in front of the couch in a good position, and then just sit down on the edge of the couch and maintain that shape. Get a sense of how this feels, and then go to relax to your regular position and see how much of a difference of positions there is, so that you can see the, I guess, the magnitude of where you need to improve or how much you need to improve. So if you find that you go from a really up tall position and you just crumple in half to relax, what you need to do instead is you need to roll up a cushion or a pillow, fill the gap that you've been filling with your back, fill that with something else, so that when you sit down, you're not having to hold yourself here, which gets annoying after a while, but you've got a better position that's taking the load off that section of your back that's potentially creating all this hip issue for you. So that's step 3. You've got to take the time to analyze your spinal shapes, your postures, and then take genuine steps to improve that over time. So that's the foundation, I guess, of the 3 main steps to fixing your hip bursitis. There's obviously a whole range of other things you can do around that. Hopefully one of which isn't ice, isn't an injection, isn't medication. But one of the other things that you can add to this, and I think we touched on it a second ago, is hip strength. The reason why I didn't put hip strength in this is because if you're trying to settle down your hip and improve the function of your lower back, those 2 things should help take care of your symptoms really quickly. And then strength work basically helps put an extra layer of reinforcement on top of that. But if you do strength work too early, and the same thing with stretching, we didn't mention stretching like hip stretches, mainly because those 2 things pull and put tension on an already irritated area. So they're valuable things to do, but sometimes they are more worthwhile doing once you feel like your symptoms have settled down a little bit and you're just working on improving your function, because that way you can be comfortable that you're not going to irritate yourself. Obviously, in a face-to-face consultation, we can make those decisions in real time. But when you're giving advice on the internet, really, you don't want to throw out anything that might be disadvantageous or that requires skilled consultation to decipher. So keep those in mind, though. Things like squats, box squats, the clams you see a lot of people do, the side-lying hip abductions, the squats with the booty bands, they're fantastic just to get your glutes firing. But as I said, make sure that you do those when you're comfortable. They're not going to annoy the crap out of your hip, because obviously it'll slow things down. It'll keep perpetuating that cycle of irritation. So again, that's just that's the outline of the 3 main steps that I follow to solve my patient's hip bursitis. If you find that useful, please leave a like below. It just helps other people see this information, makes it more likely to appear in their timelines. But I'd appreciate it if you consider subscribing as well. Hopefully this information sort of speaks to the quality of the information that we sort of present here. And there's so much stuff that is different to what's out there normally, because the stuff that's out there normally doesn't often work as well as we expect it to or hope it to. There's a whole sort of underbelly of things that we're just not focusing on that seem to work really well. So if you're happy to subscribe, then obviously you can get that information as we put it out. Again, these videos are coming out daily. If you're not sick of them by now, please continue to share them and comment below. It really helps us out. But until tomorrow, we'll see you soon. Bye.